nervous and shook I was, for lack of a better sense. But I remember sitting everyone down and being like, guys, there's something I have to tell you. And they were like, okay, what? And so I'm sitting here shaking, like on the verge of tears, and I'm like, I'm gay. And one of my friends looked at me and was like, the sky's blue, the grass is green. No one here is shocked about that. But like, thank you for finally sharing that. And so I kind of sought to create those spaces, you know, within people that I cared about. But I've done the same thing like when I moved to Chicago. And so I found some of these lovely, amazing people in the room and very much had like a similar experience where I can remember like telling Ray, and Ray was like, okay, and? So what about you guys? Have you had to create those spaces on your own, or have you sought like more organizational sides?
I've personally, I think, had experiences with both. I think specifically, especially as my brothers got older, that was a connection that I think formed more readily because we so radically empathized, I think, with each other's experience, especially of growing up in the Deep South. But I know here at Harris has been an awesome opportunity, and that's the first time I've ever really decided to get involved with organizations, specifically trying to better and make the communities of color here at Harris stronger, just because I kind of teased and thought about getting involved with different groups during my time in undergrad, but never, I don't think, truly felt confident enough to start doing meaningful work or even seeking a leadership role. That I was always down to help out or pass out flyers, but I don't think I felt maybe necessarily authentic enough in my early 20s to demonstrate leadership.
Yeah, I don't think that I've ever found or like sought out organizations to find community. But I mean, as like I was talking about earlier, I did find my space within a bunch of other mixed people, and that was kind of where I was able to find my comfort, you know, space. But I don't know, for me, I think it was more of like a self-discovery. You know, after my whole story about the professor telling that to me, that was like a really big moment for me, and that was really important for me. And I remember after that kind of just like seeking out people with like particularly my experience. And like I remember finding a book that this guy had wrote, and he's like a photographer, and the whole book was just like photographs and stories of Hapa people, Hapa being like half Asian, half white. I remember finding this book and looking at these pictures and being like, oh my God, we exist. There's so many of us and we're so beautiful, you know? And I just, for me, that was the ultimate reassurance that this is really cool. Like, I like this. This is a journey and I love it. And there's people like me and I love that.
Do you want to talk about how like the podcast came into being, the conversations that the three of us had?
Basically, the long story short behind this podcast coming up was that James, Ray, and I were talking one night over dinner. And we were talking specifically and had the realization that so many of our stories pulled on really, really similar narratives, that it was us us seeking a reflection of ourselves in society, in our friend groups, and not necessarily finding it initially. And not finding people that looked like us, but I think seeing ourselves reflected in other identities, especially from people that necessarily didn't look like us. The fact that Ray and I's experience of feeling mixed and really torn and experiencing a childhood where you felt like you didn't identify with either dominant group that you were growing up around was a really, really powerful experience. Or even James and I's experience of growing up in the Deep South, in a place that is deeply religious, that means a lot and does so much for so many communities, but also struggling with a lot of the teachings that presents.
Yeah, I think we definitely found some community just initially between the three of us for that, and then kind of sought out other people that filled those spaces as well. And so I think the purpose of like KSB is to kind of like we're in a policy school and we're studying, you know, how to be policymakers and write policies for everyone. But I think it's important to recognize that those policies affect people differently. And I think coming from a place of having an intersectional identity, you're able to look at that from like multiple lenses. So I guess my question for you guys is, how do you think that's going to inform your work, like going forward from Harris?
I specifically came back to grad school because I grew up in the Deep South, specifically in coastal communities. So I'm living in a place that is seeing the realities of climate change unfold in front of it. But the costs of these things aren't evenly split, that they're not uniformly distributed. It's localized, it's hyper-localized, and the communities that are already suffering from a lot of other historical injustices are going to be the ones facing these costs. That's true in Charleston, South Carolina, where I grew up, but also in South Florida, where I really launched my professional career in the U.S. and began working with groups there. So specifically, I wanted to make sure that the people who are already paying stormwater taxes and are already spending millions of dollars a year pumping water out of their communities, that they have a voice, that they have the ability to really advocate for solutions that work for them and not just work on a fiscal matter, which is important too, but to make sure that the solutions are both personally and fiscally responsible.
The thing that I kind of realized the more we talk about our podcast and the more we talk to people about our podcast and record more episodes is that I think I think that a lot of people, what we're doing resonates with them. I want to talk about the traditional sense of intersectionality, but also just briefly, I want to like tangentially talk about the fact that like I've come to realize that everyone has like a really unique perspective of the world, and it's really beautiful and it's really awesome to hear. And I've just found so much joy in just talking about the podcast and then people telling me, like, I remember talking to you, Izzy, and you being like, oh yes, this resonates with me, and like telling me your story. And I think that's really beautiful. And I think people have like really, really rich and unique perspectives that I think should be highlighted and people should know about. But then going back to the more like definition of intersectionality, it's like it has to do with compounding identities that are systematically disadvantaging. And so for me, I'm interested in criminal justice reform. And if we think about people of color or transgender people in like the incarceral system, their journey through the incarceral system is like wildly different and worse. And I think that like understanding the roles that each of these identities play is super important, and that's why I do this, and that's why I want to have this podcast and have these conversations.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That was really powerful. I think coming at it from my perspective, working in finance prior to coming to Harris, I was able to see how you mentioned, the more boxes you check in terms of marginalization, the more like, less knowledgeable you were of the financial system. And I can just remember like seeing people that had identities similar to mine, like not being able to get resources that they needed. And so I think moving forward for me, like I want to be in a better position to, impart my knowledge to them moving forward. So I kind of wanted to give you guys a little bit of background on why we chose to record this specific episode and place it so early in our lineup. We wanted to give you guys some knowledge of where we're coming from when we're approaching these complex topics and from our own respective identities, as well as, kind of taking on that political lens as well. So with that said, we're going to go ahead and wrap up.
Thank you guys so much for listening. Thank you so much for our freaking incredible team here at the podcast. Ray's awesome. Izzy's awesome. Olive's awesome. James is also technically awesome.
I'm all right.
This has been your three co-hosts, Kurt Nugent,
Rei Bertoldi,
James Johnson,
and we look forward to hearing ourselves talk with you next time.